Senators, I am a Métis Ukrainian who was born, raised, and live on Treaty 6 territory, and it is my profound honor to rise once again in this chamber today as sponsor of Bill C-15, an act respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a bill that answers the TRC calls to action number 43 and 44. And Senators, it's time to finally take action. Colleagues, you will recall that this bill has 7 clauses and 2 purposes. First, it affirms UNDRIP as having application in Canadian law. And second, it provides a framework for the Government of Canada's implementation of the Declaration. You will also recall that the Standing Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples completed a fulsome study of Bill C-15. Our study included 20 panels, dozens of witnesses, and a broad spectrum of opinions and expertise that outlined the benefits and challenges of the bill. We also heard similar perspectives from multiple witnesses, which, from an evidence-gathering standpoint, repetition indicates that we've reached saturation and most likely heard all perspectives. The process was well-planned, systematic, and I thank all committee members for their thoughtful questions and respectful study of the bill. Colleagues, I think it's important to discuss and dispel the fears that have been expressed regarding what Bill C-15 will and will not do. We had witnesses that expressed concerns that Bill C-15 would immediately adopt the 46 articles of UNDRIP into Canadian law and cause legal chaos. One witness was also apprehensive that provincial laws would be affected as well. Colleagues, this is not accurate. The Declaration is currently and will remain an interpretive instrument. In fact, since 2010, when UNDRIP was endorsed by the Harper government, Canadian courts have been able to use UNDRIP to interpret Canadian law. This will not change should the bill receive royal assent. On the other hand, some Indigenous people have said that Bill C-15 will therefore either accomplish nothing or diminish existing rights and/or treaty rights. Colleagues, I understand the cynicism of Indigenous people and leaders who may not believe nor trust that any government would be invested in real change. However, Minister Lemeni stated in our committee that, quote, by bringing UNDRIP into specific implementing legislation, we have reinforced that interpretive role and given greater weight to it as a document. The Declaration itself, as well as the rights contained in the preamble, have interpretive force in Canadian law. The minister went on to say that, quote, it also binds us. To that extent, this implements legislation. This is so important, colleagues, because we are not here debating a policy or a program announcement. Bill C-15 is legislation that binds this and future governments to the process of revising laws to reflect the UNDRIP articles and to develop and implement an action plan. It obliges the Canadian government to work in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, broadly defined, to accomplish these tasks. And importantly, Bill C-15 includes a requirement for the development of annual reports, and those reports are then permanently referred to the relevant committee of each House of Parliament for study, consideration, and comment on progress. It holds the federal government publicly accountable, and such transparency will no doubt influence the success of these consultations. To be clear, this means the Senate will continue to have a role to play in providing parliamentary oversight, and the annual report will contribute to accountability for making progress on implementing the Declaration. In fact, Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot told the committee that Bill C-15 is setting a new standard in the implementation of UNDRIP. It's a combination of 1, legislation to set out a very systematic and methodical framework, 2, the specific provisions for the creation of a national action plan, and 3, the reporting of and accountability framework, which makes Bill C-15 globally unique and precedent-setting. Further, many Indigenous lawyers and scholars have spoken about the power of Bill C-15 to assist in resolving some of the more difficult and complex issues that have plagued First Nations for decades. Mary Ellen Terpelefon stated that, quote, one of the reasons why Bill C-15 is important is because we are dealing with a very significant time where work is happening within First Nations, and that work needs to be aided by the implementation of UNDRIP. I don't view this bill as a bill that strips away Indigenous people's rights, she said. I view it as a bill that affirms their rights. She went on to say that, quote, there are debates inside First Nations, in particular about the proper role of who represents whom, the continuing role of the Indian Act, and the significance of strengthening the position of Treaty First Nations. I think Bill C-15 will help us sort through those issues," unquote. That is to say, it is Tripel Lafon's expert position that Bill C-15 is an important tool that will help us resolve those long-standing issues. This is a position also shared by many Indigenous legal scholars and experts. In addition, colleagues, much has been said about the consultation process the government undertook to develop C-15. While it is true that former MP Romeo Saganash consulted Indigenous people across Canada in the development of his private member's bill, C-262, and it's also true that the government used that bill as a starting point for the development of Bill C-15, and subsequently, the government did hold 70 consultation meetings nationally and spoke with hundreds of Indigenous people. The fact remains that some Indigenous leaders are not satisfied with the way in which they were consulted and therefore do not support Bill C-15. It's also true that Indigenous people have different expectations of consultation from a lone Indigenous MP than they have of the government in the depth, breadth, and scope of consultation on a government bill that is centered on Indigenous human rights. However, there are also many perspectives on how the consultation went and support for the bill. Take, for example, the leadership in the beautiful Treaty 6 territory where I reside. On one hand, we heard from Grand Chief Okimau Watchmaker and other chiefs that they did not support the bill. Of note, Chief Arkand from the Alexander First Nation gave an articulate, thoughtful presentation about how he would prefer to restart the treaty negotiation tables of 1995 than be distracted by consultation on an action plan. On the other hand, we received a written submission from 4 treaty rights-holding chiefs, including the past 2 Grand Chiefs of Treaty 6, current Cree Nation chiefs, and Alberta regional chiefs supporting Bill C-15, stating, "The processes contemplated in C-15 are sufficiently flexible to implement the UN Declaration at the treaty table and as a part of ongoing treaty relationships. It is our view it will be critical for First Nations to proactively take the lead in the processes mandated by Bill C-15. Senators, it should not be alarming that there are different opinions about a bill across over 600 First Nations. In the same way that we do not expect all actors in any other level of government to agree on an issue, we should not expect consensus across Indigenous leadership either. First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous communities are diverse culturally, politically, and geographically, and will hold a variety of valid opinions. However, colleagues, it would be a disservice to the breadth of evidence we have gathered to omit the fact that the majority of Indigenous leaders support C-15. This includes the national leaders of the Assembly of First Nations, the Métis National Council, and Inuit Tapirit Kanatami. We also had letters, briefs, and testimonies of many grassroots rights holders that supported Bill C-15, including the Chief Counselor of the Haisla Nation, National Chief of the Dene Nation, Grand Chief of the Grand Council of the Crees, the Grand Chief of the Gwich'in Tribal Council, Chief of Pasqua First Nation, Chief of Chissasabi Cree Nation, the Cree Nation of Namaska, the Chief of Samson Cree Nation, the Cree Nation of Eastmain, the Cree Nation of Waiminji, the Chiakta First Nation, Ujiboogamoo Cree Nation, the Chief of Lennox Island First Nation, the Chief of Cree Nation of Washasibi, the Chief of Wakmuxtu First Nation, the Chief of Enoch Cree Nation, and the Chief of Louis Bull Tribe. We also heard from Indigenous business leaders about how C-15 can facilitate economic reconciliation and the role that sustainable economic development can and must play in addressing ongoing socioeconomic disadvantage. These witnesses include the Canada Council for Aboriginal Business, the National Indigenous Economic Development Board, the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation Association, and the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. There is also a large cadre of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit lawyers and scholars who want us to pass the bill, even if they have suggested ways to improve it. They include Mary Ellen Tripel-Lafond, Ellen Gabriel, Dr. Naomi Metallic, Dr. Cheryl Lightfoot, Dr. Val Napoleon, Dr. Brenda Gunn, and Dr. Pam Pomander. Let's just pause, colleagues, to acknowledge this powerhouse of thoughtful, brilliant Indigenous women leaders dedicated to the full realization of Indigenous human rights. Their voices have been and will remain so important in the implementation of UNDRIP. In summary, there is an evidence base for the claim that Bill C-15 has broad support. And finally, I just want to be clear, honorable senators. Although I am very grateful to the government for fulfilling its promise it made in this chamber of 2019, implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not about this government or its accomplishments. And while I'm grateful to our colleagues on the APA committee, as well as the clerks, translators, and other staff for the hard work we completed in the study of this bill, passing Bill C-15 is not about congratulating the Senate or the sponsor of the bill. Passing C-15 is about honoring the leaders in the 70s who began this process of reclaiming basic human rights for Indigenous people. It's about the next step in the over 2 decades of work by Indigenous people at the UN to draft, negotiate, and adopt the Declaration. It's about respecting every Indigenous advocate, legal scholar, and academic who has worked on bringing the Declaration home since 2007. It's about acknowledging every one of over 7,000 residential school survivors who gave testimony about their experiences of living without human rights and the trauma they and their families carry. It's about the thousands of children who died anonymously at the schools and their families who are still grieving. It's about every missing and murdered Indigenous woman and girl. It's about the children who are growing up in Indigenous communities right now without adequate housing, water, healthcare, nor access to the same educational supports as other Canadian children. It's about access to land and water, to traditional foods and medicines, and the ability to practice traditional culture and spiritual ceremonies freely and with pride. It's about every pipe that was lifted and prayer that was offered for the healing of Indigenous people, families, and communities. As we move forward and conclude our discussions on Bill C-15, we must remember that the Declaration stands for affirming Indigenous peoples' human rights and self-determination. The Declaration is about realizing a full range of economic, social, cultural, political, and civil rights that are essential to the dignity and well-being of Indigenous people. It is about addressing the extensive and mounting evidence of systemic racism and discrimination faced by Indigenous peoples and the legacies of colonialism. To this day, the evidence continues to grow through countless reports and inquiries exposing discriminatory practices, whether in healthcare, policing, the justice system, or delivery of public services. Senators, this is another step, a big step, mind you, in the implementation of Indigenous human rights in Canada. Let's not fumble the ball before we cross the end zone. Let's pass this bill. Our ancestors and our great-grandchildren are counting on us. Kinana Schoolmatin. Hi, hi.